Well, let's take this further then. Bring in Professor Dirk Kotzé, who's joining us this evening also for commentary on the Madlanga Commission of Inquiry and the first day of evidence from the National Police Commissioner. That's Fannie Masemola. Prof, good to have you on the program. So this has come up quite a bit in the security analysis in the last while, but I want to take it up with you as well. This contradiction in Masemola's evidence, initially saying that he would not obey or enforce an order that was unlawful from the minister, then seemingly qualifying it towards the end and explaining why, when it came to the dissolution of the political killings task team, that would change somewhat. How well did he do in explaining that contradiction?
Yes, I think I'm with it now. Yes, I think today he struggled initially in order to maintain that distinction or to apply the constitutional distinction between a national commissioner and the Minister of Police. I think the judge, the chairperson of the commission, in a sense, guided him or forced him even into a direction where he ultimately conceded what was just now discussed, what is supposed to be the legal position. I think, and I agree, that there is certainly in the relationship between the minister and the national commissioner of police, it's similar to that of a minister and the director general. There is certainly also some political connotations involved. It's not completely divorced from political relations that exist there. And from a political point of view, the minister is the more senior person, while the national commissioner is supposed to be not involved in any form of party politics or politics in general. But it's inevitable that, especially in our situation, it often does happen. So I think this is where General Masemola tried to cover himself in both directions. That on the one hand, he had to concede or listen to or abide by the position of Minister Mkhulu, but at the same time, his constitutional responsibility was in order to apply the police policy in an independent way.
Something else that he said just when he was being pressed by the commission chairperson on this contradiction around his obedience of an unlawful instruction or order from the minister. And I think what he said was, if this is the correct wording, that, you know, us government workers, we go through things or we see things, perhaps suggesting what you were talking about, the sort of pressure that's brought to bear on the people who are in charge of the operational functions of the state machinery. How much do you think his evidence today has actually pulled back the veil on that issue of the political heads basically bringing pressure to bear on their subordinates, perhaps even to act unlawfully or unethically?
Well, I think we've seen a lot of that over the last number of years. During the time of state capture, it was very open for all of us to see ultimately towards the end, because there the officials or the administration, public administration, were in a sense not only co-opted, but they were forced in order to implement the policies or the wishes of their ministers. I think what we are seeing lately is that the cabinet has adopted a policy document last year, I think, which refers to the professionalization of the public sector. And that is indeed in order to emphasize what is the domain of the executive, the ministers, and what is the domain of the public officials. Because in the past, that distinction was blurred. And I think what we heard now, in the case of the police service, is a blurring of that distinction that's supposed to be maintained, but very often is not maintained. And I think this is where we are seeing where ministers, when they have, let's say, a political agenda or an agenda, impose it on their officials. And that is where problems like what we have now seen actually comes from.
Does it cover Masemola in any glory then that in his evidence today he basically said that the one thing that he, to paraphrase, ensured wouldn't happen would be the immediate disbandment of this political killings task team, proposing instead a more phased approach to its dissolution? Does that give him any grace as a leader?
Well, to some extent, because I think we in the public domain have the impression that the task team was never really dissolved or disbanded, despite the instruction by the minister. So to some extent, yes, that is the case, that the position of the two generals, both Masemola and Mkhwanazi, to a large extent pushed back what the Minister Mkhunu wanted to be achieved in the form of dissolving it. So, and the fact that it is still effectively continuing at the moment, I think provides evidence for that.
But is it unfair, Professor Kotzé, to expect someone who holds the position of National Police Commissioner in this country to basically resist outright? Because the impression that was given by General Masemola today is that actually he ultimately, not in so many words, felt that he couldn't give the minister a no in capital letters without having to negotiate further or bend to his will to some degree. And is this a clear case of political interference, perhaps even bullying, on the part of Minister Mkhunu, at least as far as the accounts given by the KZN Commissioner, Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi, and today the National Commissioner, Masemola?
I think the guideline that we can use is, and what is in the Constitution in Section 207, is that the minister determines, together with the government, determines the police policy. But the implementation of the policy is the responsibility of the National Commissioner and the rest of the police service. And that although therefore there is, in essence, it is a political policy. It's policy determined by the executive, by the political side. The implementation is not done by the executive. And I think, again, this is possibly where the overlap between the two took place, because the instruction of the minister was clearly an implementation instruction. It wasn't a policy instruction about policy implementation. And I think this is where General Masemola struggled a bit in order to maintain the distinction between policy on the one hand and his implementation responsibilities. But the National Commissioner and the rest of the police team or services are not policymakers in that respect. And I think many people don't necessarily understand that the policy comes from the executive side, and the top leadership of the police service are there for implementation. Now, whether the disbandment of the task team is regarded by the minister as a policy matter, right, I think that's very difficult for him to justify that.
Should an operational head of the police, i.e. the commissioner, as he was saying, this instruction would basically have encroached on the operational territory which comes with his roles and responsibilities, should someone then who bent by his own account to some degree to the will of the minister be allowed to remain in post? What does that mean for his stance as a fit and proper leader of the police at an operational level?
I think that's behind what we saw today, is that he realized that this distinction that we are talking about actually puts the onus on him to say, well, that instruction by the minister was overstepping the distinction between the executive and the public sector or the public service. And therefore, he had to insist on it that he cannot implement that and that it will therefore be unconstitutional or unlawful. And the fact that there is uncertainty about to what extent he ultimately implemented that. And I think this will be one of the components of the commission to determine whether the task team, in effect, in reality, continued or not as a result of this instruction. But I think this is where General Masemola feels most possibly that he has to protect his reputation. And if it is clear that he acted against the Constitution or legality, then it will have been reflection on him.
Dirk Kotzé, Professor Dirk Kotzé from the University of South Africa, always good to have your time on the SABC. Thank you so much for speaking to us this evening.